In the last episode of this show, okay, I don't know if I just got cut off there. I'll try again. In the last episode of this show, I did a survey of the contemporaneous literature to the New Testament, in which the Greek word helkyo or helko, translated draws in John 6:44, is used. I did a survey of literature in which that word was used in order to find out if it contains within its semantic domain, its range of meanings, a word that does not include effectuality, a word that does not entail an affected change of position. And I concluded anyway, from that survey of literature that no, that just is not in the semantic domain of the word. Well, since that episode, a friend of mine, an Arminian Molinist, has responded to that, poking some holes, or at least attempting to poke some holes in my argument, and attempting a reading, a non-Calvinist reading of John 6:44, that he proposes accounts for the conclusions I came to. And so what we're going to do in today's episode of Theopologetics is explore and respond to that response. Here we go. Hi, this is Chris Date, and welcome to Theopologetics, where every other week I discuss a wide variety of theological issues and show how a properly biblical worldview can help defend the historic Christian faith from its critics. Join me as we think through what we believe and why we believe it, and not something else. Well, hello, I am Chris Date, as per usual, and I'm going to skip all of the almost introductory sort of housekeeping type stuff that I do at the beginning of my shows, because I have a limited amount of time for this episode. As you can see on the screen now, immediately after, or at least almost immediately after the stream right now, I will be appearing on Kevin Thompson's Beyond the Fundamentals YouTube channel to discuss the nature and duration of hell. And that's going to be at 8 p.m. Pacific, which is 2 hours after now, and well, actually more like an hour and 58 minutes from now. So I've got a limited amount of time to do this stream, and I'd like both to be on time for that stream and to give you time to tune into that stream, should you decide that you want to do so. So we're going to get started now and just jump right in. I've got the URL to that show up there on the screen in case you want to note it down, but you should be able to just find the Beyond the Fundamentals YouTube channel and find the stream, the scheduled stream, with that thumbnail on it, and be ready to tune in as soon as 8 p.m. Pacific arrives, which will be a small amount of time after this stream concludes. How much time, it will depend on how quickly I get through my presentation. Let me set the stage for what we're doing today. I did a survey of literature, as I explained. Thank you, Susan, for posting that in the chat. I really appreciate it. Last episode of the show, I went through a survey of, as I explained in the cold open to today's show, last show I went through a survey of the meanings of the word helkyo in John 6:44 in relevant contemporaneous literature, because we were looking at a topic related to soteriology, the branch of systematic theology that deals with salvation. We looked very briefly at the 5 points of Calvinism. We focused on 2 of them last episode. This episode will focus on 1, namely the I in tulip, irresistible grace, which last episode I defined as effectual calling. I was quoting Alan Cairns, who says that irresistible grace is the act of divine power that brings a person to Christ, brings a believer to Christ. And we looked at John 6:44, in which Jesus says, "No one can come to me, udunatai, does not have the ability to, is not able to. No one is able to come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him." And I explained that the Greek word there is helkyo, or in older Greek, helko. I explained that the reason why the transliteration of helkyo into English has a Y instead of a U is because after consonants, the upsilon is transliterated with a Y. That's why psyche, which has an upsilon, a U, enters into English as psyche. And then I explained that the reason you say helkyo or helkyo is because the accent tells you where the emphasis is, where the stress is. And I played a brief clip from a debate featuring my friend and colleague, Dr. Leighton Flowers, in which he asks his Calvinist opponent, why do you assume effectuality on the word draw when the word enable doesn't assume effectuality? Now, by the way, it's funny, I'm actually laughing a little bit right now because an hour or two before this stream right now started, somebody posted on that last episode, commented saying, where do you get the idea that Flowers doesn't think that the drawing is effectual? Well, I mean, I'm quoting him. He's the one who is implying that draw isn't effectual. So I'll leave that to you, whoever that was that commented on that last episode, to explain where you get the impression that Flowers does think that draw is effectual. Because, I mean, I quoted him in the debate, and he seemed to be implying that the word shouldn't be assumed to be effectual. Well, anyway, so in reply to that question, I did a survey of uses of the word helkyo in relevant contemporaneous literature, and I sought to answer the question, can helkyo refer to an action that does not affect a change, that isn't effectual? And we explored 5 layers of relevant contemporaneous literature. We focused first on the Gospel of John itself. I think I might have also included the Johannine epistles. I can't remember off the top of my head, and it may be that the word isn't used in the Johannine epistles. But either way, I included the Gospel of John first, and then I'm jumping ahead of myself. And then I looked at the rest of the New Testament as the next layer of the next most relevant body of literature. And then I looked at what I considered to be the next most relevant body of literature, which are the writings of the first century Jewish historian Josephus, writing a couple of decades at most, if that, after John wrote his gospel. And then we looked at what I considered to be the fourth layer of the fourth most relevant layer of contemporaneous literature, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament known as the Septuagint, which was completed in the couple of centuries leading up to John's writing the gospel. And then finally, I looked at what I deemed the fifth most relevant body of literature, which was the writings of the first century Hellenized Jewish philosopher, Philo. And the reason even though that was arguably more contemporaneous to John than either Josephus or the Septuagint, I still deemed it less relevant than those other two, because it is such a highly technical, highly philosophical piece of work, unlike the others. And having conducted that survey, I concluded, rightly or wrongly, that there is no room in the semantic domain of helkyo in New Testament koine for a meaning like invite or enable, the meanings that Dr. Flowers proposed for helkyo in that debate. There is no room, I concluded, for a meaning like invite or enable that doesn't imply an affected change. Now, in that stream, a friend of mine, an Arminian Molinist by the name of Dan Chapa, he tuned in for the first part of the stream. He had to leave, and then he came back and watched it later. But when I saw him in the stream, I mentioned that he, not only that he's a friend, but that I consider him very astute. I have a great deal of admiration and respect for him, and that remains true to this day. In fact, I am, for the time being anyway, I think that there are two non-Calvinist critics of Calvinism that I think have even the slightest chance of possibly one day convincing me to abandon Calvinism. One of them is Dan Chapa, the person who I mentioned was in the stream that day. The other one, in case you're curious, is David Paulman, despite the fact that he works for a clothing store as opposed to being a professor. Nevertheless, he is one of the two people. And the reason why Dan Chapa and David Paulman have a better chance of convincing me to leave Calvinism than anybody else, in my estimation, at the present time, is because they, unlike anyone else, to a degree unlike anyone else, any other critic of Calvinism that is, they actually engage our arguments meaningfully. They hear them, they listen to them, they try to understand them, and they interact with them. And more than that, they also acknowledge when their previous positions might be mistaken, their previous explanations of certain texts. So, for example, in the case of David Paulman, this was a couple of years ago, something like that, I appeared on a show with him discussing the passage in the book of Acts where it says, everyone who was appointed unto eternal life believed. And at the time, if I remember correctly, David Paulman was arguing, or at least had previously argued, that text means something like those who prepared themselves for eternal life believed. But he, if I'm remembering correctly, and my memory is very, very, very fallible, as my wife can attest, my recollection is that he had prior to that show, or he did after, abandoned that reading. He didn't he didn't embrace Calvinism, or the individual predestination. But he did abandon that particular reading because of the evidence. Similarly, Dan Chapa, I think, sees some validity to the arguments I gave in last episode. We're going to be talking about that in a moment. But no, I'm sorry, with as much love as I have for Dr. Leighton Flowers as my friend, as my colleague, I don't think that he really seriously engages us Calvinists. And Leighton, if you hear me say that, I'm sorry if that hurts, but I'm just being honest. I don't think that Leighton Flowers really takes our arguments seriously. And so he really doesn't have a chance, it seems to me, of convincing me. That doesn't mean he's a bad guy. It doesn't mean he's a bad scholar. It just means that he is, in my estimation, not somebody that's likely to persuade me, because he doesn't seriously engage our arguments or even our position at times. But I think David Paulman and Dan Chapa do. At the very least, to a much greater degree than Leighton or any other non-Calvinist critic of Calvinism that I have encountered the work of. So yes, I have a great deal of admiration for Dan Chapa. I respect him highly, and he and David Paulman are the ones that if anybody were to convince me to abandon Calvinism, it would likely be one or both of them. Now, the reason I say that is because since that show, after that show 2 weeks ago, Dan Chapa issued somewhat of a response. And it was in the context of a discussion that he had with a Calvinist, somebody who was a fellow Calvinist with me, who goes by the pseudonym Turretin Fan, meaning he's a fan of Francis Turretin, the reformer. That episode in which they had that discussion featured on April 25th, 2022, obviously, just within the past 2 weeks, on Turretin Fan's YouTube channel. And the title of it is, Does John 6 Teach Irresistible Grace? ? Response to Chris Date. And so I knew that, or very shortly after my show 2 weeks ago, Dan said he would be doing a response. So I expected this, and I figured, hey, I'd love to do. I planned on doing a response to that response, and that's what we're going to be doing today. Now, their discussion was an hour or an hour and a half, something like that. And if I just played the entirety of their discussion, pausing along the way, then this would turn into a response that's greater than the ones that Leighton Flowers is known for, and I'm not going to do that. Instead, what I've done is picked out what I think are the most relevant clips worth addressing. And moreover, what I'm about to do is go through the clips, but not in the order in which they appeared. This is really important. I am not trying to distort or take out of context anything that Dan said, but I did want to organize his and Turret and Fan's comments into a structure that would make it conducive to a meaningful response. And so what I've done is I've taken those clips that I've identified that I want to respond to, and I've broken them out into these 5 sort of sections of the response I'm about to offer. We're going to look at we're going to talk about a few miscellaneous topics. Then we're going to look at an alleged counterexample or two, that is, what are alleged to be a text or two that challenge my conclusions from last episode. Namely, that there is no room within the semantic domain of helkyo for invite or enable, something that doesn't involve an affected change. And then we're going to look at the impact had on our interpretation of John 6:44 by, or what should be, how our reading of John 6:44 should be impacted by what is said in verse 45 and verse 65. Then we're going to look at the impact, or what should be the impact, on how we understand John 6:44 in light of context, namely disbelief, and we'll get to that when we get there. And then finally, I'm going to offer a very inchoate, that means underdeveloped, nascent, preliminary. I'm going to offer a preliminary analysis of Dan's reading, it's not going to be one in which I conclude that his reading is impossible, but I am going to argue that his reading seems to lack, it faces some challenges and seems to lack some merit. All right? And my hope will be that the sort of asynchronous conversation that Dan and I are having, meaning asynchronous just means it's not happening at the same time, right? So I did something, and then later Dan did something, and now I'm doing something back. My hope is that this asynchronous dialogue that we're having and may continue to have will be something that will help progress the discussion, the debate between Calvinists and non-Calvinists, because it's my contention at this point anyway that what I've concluded about the semantic domain of draw is accurate, and any non-Calvinist interpretation of John 6:44, or maybe I should say any interpretation of John 6:44 that does not entail Calvinism, will need to take account for the fact that helkyo doesn't have within its semantic domain a meaning like invite or enable, something that just might affect the change but may not. All right. So let's begin with a few clips having to do with some miscellaneous topics, and we'll begin with this one.
There's a difference between pulling on a boulder in English, pulling on a boulder, which you can do without moving the boulder, and pulling a boulder, which is a little bit ambiguous, and dragging a boulder, which is not ambiguous, and it can't mean just pulling on the boulder. And the point that Chris is making, if I understood him correctly, and I think I did, is that the word helkyo carries with it a sense like the word drag. Now you can say he tried to drag the boulder and failed, but if he dragged the boulder, then that implies that the boulder moved. Because because dragging carries with it it carries with it the implication that the thing being dragged is moved by the dragging. It's not like the word, when we say pull on something, that just carries with it the sense of the force being applied. It doesn't carry with it any kind of result.
Now, the reason I wanted to play that clip was just because Turret and Fan did a fantastic job explaining why the transitivity of the word draw matters. A transitive verb is one in which a subject acts upon a direct object. And one of the things that I explained in last episode was that in some of the places in other texts where the word is argued by non-Calvinists to mean something like invite or enable, something that may or may not affect a change, it's not being used transitively with people as its direct object. It's instead drawing with a prepositional phrase. And I didn't do the best job of explaining why that would matter to the meaning of the word here. And Turret and Fan did a fantastic job. If I say that you pull on a boulder, that has that in no way implies affected change. If I say he pulled the boulder, well, it's a little ambiguous, just like Turret and Fan said. Pull versus pull on have slightly different shades of meaning, but pull in the sense of dragging, without a prepositional phrase and instead with a direct object, is not ambiguous. It means affect a change. So I really appreciated the way that Turret and Fan drew that out. Now, one additional reason I wanted to play this clip is just to say that. Oh wait, was there another thing he said here? Okay, was because the other reason I wanted to play this clip is because it features Turret and Fan. That particular clip does, and I just wanted to let those of you viewers who are watching know that Turret and Fan and I have a debate scheduled on Marlon Wilson's The Gospel Truth YouTube channel. It's scheduled for May 23rd, and it will be on the nature and duration of hell. So I just would encourage you to check it out. I don't. There's not any part of me that is concerned about the arguments that Turret and Fan will be bringing to bear. I don't think that there will be anything new or surprising there, but I do have a great deal of respect and admiration for Turret and Fan. He and I have sparred, crossed swords, proverbially speaking, like a decade ago, soon after I became a conditionalist, and I'm looking forward to finally getting to have a formal moderated debate with him, and I have it on good authority that I can expect him to treat me better than some of my other opponents have. So I'm really looking forward to that. But anyway, that was one topic, miscellaneous. The why transitivity matters when it comes to this word helkyo. So now the next miscellaneous topic.
Now, some people have tried to argue that drawing isn't an effectual verb. It doesn't have to do with the effect. And therefore, God can draw everybody, and only some people come. But since the drawing refers to the results, not to the effort, that way out doesn't work. The idea that the Father draws everyone doesn't work.
So I played that clip just to explain why I even used the phrase last episode, focus like a laser beam, which if I recall I got from Michael Medved, a Jewish radio show host. And Turret and Fan just did a great job of explaining why I focused with such laser focus on the semantic domain of helkyo. Because if, as I contended, it's the case that word just does mean to effect the change of position, then there's at least one popular non-Calvinist reading of John 6:44 that will not work. And that reading is when Jesus says, "No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him." Some non-Calvinists, a popular non-Calvinist response is to say, yeah, and he is drawing everyone. Apart from his drawing activity, nobody could come to Jesus. But it wouldn't follow from that everyone comes to Jesus. It just means that everyone is being drawn to him, and some give into that drawing, or some are persuaded or whatever. But what Turret and Fan is rightly observing here is that reading will not work if I'm right about the semantic domain of helkyo. And a non-Calvinist reading of John 6:44 would have to account for the fact that helkyo just means to effect a change of position, sometimes violently, right? So in other words, or to put it another way, the reading that Dr. Flowers has often offered, that draw means something like enable or invite, would not work. That reading is not legitimate, is not plausible. Now, that doesn't mean that Calvinism is true. It just means that a non-Calvinist has to offer a better reading, a legitimate reading, unlike the one that Dr. Flowers tends to offer. And then one more topic, miscellaneous. This is just a passing remark that Dan Chapa made, and I just wanted to reply to it really quickly.
So the question isn't, what man can do without grace, but does the passage teach that grace is effectual or irresistible? Maybe two different ways of saying kind of the same thing. basically, does it teach that when God works on the human heart to bring a person to faith, is that work of God, and it's not a term that either one of you, I think, will love, but to me, it's the clearest way of saying it, is God's grace, when he works on the human heart to bring it to faith, is it causally deterministic?
Is it causally deterministic? And Dan suggested that neither Turret and Fan nor I, especially, I don't know if Turret and Fan objects to the phrase causal determinism, but I do, and the reason is because, as I've argued in past episodes of the show and in other contexts, my position isn't that that God exhaustively foreordains everything by means of causing those things. I don't think that him predetermining everything that takes place in time in any way necessitates that he causes all things that take place in time. But that doesn't mean that I object to Dan's use of the phrase here. And the reason is for precisely what I just said. I don't think that everything that God predetermines in space and time, which is everything, I don't think that everything that he determines in space and time he causes. But I do think that some things he causes. And regeneration, coming to having one's heart of stone that is opposed militantly to God, replaced with a heart of flesh that is sensitive to God, and eventuates inevitably in belief, that act, that divine act of God, is something he does. He does cause, in a very meaningful sense, people, the elect, to come to Christ, in my view, in a Calvinistic view. So I have absolutely no problem with Dan suggesting that this proposed act of regeneration, logically preceding faith, that we Calvinists think God must do for anybody in order for them to come to faith. I have no objections with him causing that causally determined. But it wouldn't follow. It wouldn't follow from that therefore anything God predetermines, he causes. Now, topics miscellaneous out of the way, let's turn to alleged counterexamples. What I mean here is, again, I've said this a couple of times now, the 5 layers of relevant contemporaneous literature that I looked at, I surveyed and came to the conclusion that nowhere does helkyo ever mean something like invite or enable, something that may or may not affect a change. Well, Dan, in his discussion with Turret and Fan, offered what he thought might be a counterexample. Let's listen.
Now, I did find an example where it was used, I think, intransitively, and I'd be happy to hear your thoughts, but it's from classical Greek rather than Koine Greek. But I'll just pop this on the screen real quick. Okay, so let's see. Okay, and this is from Plato's Republic. And are there not other practices going to consider these that have pleasure attached to them, and that flatter and solicit our souls, but do not win over men of any decency? And there's the form of helkyo right there, which is solicit. At least here it's translated solicit our souls, but do not win over men of any decency. Right? So that seems to be an intransitive usage. I could be mistaken. But I think I would have to accept that. Well, that's classical Greek, not Koine.
So let's look at this alleged counterexample. And I appreciate that Dan acknowledges that this is classical Greek and therefore its relevance may be limited. We'll come back to that in a moment. But I'm going to argue that actually this isn't even a counterexample, even if one does include classical Greek in their survey of what helkyo might mean. So let's look at the text. Here is the Greek. Epiteidumata hedonas echanta ha kalakue men hemon tein psuchein kai helke eth auta pethe du. All right. The translation from which Dan read reads, practices that have pleasures attached, that flatter and solicit our souls, but do not win over, etc., etc., etc. And the way that Dan is reading that, and if this is how the text actually were properly translated, he'd have an argument. What he's arguing is that, look, if Plato is here affirming that these hedonistic practices draw our souls but do not win over people of high morals, which would include the author. He's not saying he's won over. Well, then that would be an example where draw does not entail an affected change of position. So it would be a counterexample to my conclusions. But here's the problem. This translation, and I don't know who translated this, I just know that it's provided by what's known as the Perseus Digital Library, does not precisely reflect the original Greek. This is what it actually says. So, epiteidumata is the subject of the verb echanta. Practices having, it's a participle, heidonas, pleasures, all right? So he's talking about practices having pleasures. Then ha is the relative pronoun which. Men is, when you have a men de, and you can see that here's men between on the second line, and then de is the middle word in the fourth line here. When you have a men de, it tends to mean like on the one hand and on the other hand. So hakalakue, men, means which on the one hand flatter, and then you have hemontein psuchein, our souls. Or literally it's our soul, but the soul of us, right? So it's a way of saying our souls. So these practices that have hedonistic pleasures, they do on the one hand flatter our souls, and kai, helke, draw ephauta, toward themselves. See, remember what I said about that transitivity stuff. This is not saying tein psuchein, hemon tein psuchein, our souls, is not a direct object of helke. It is a direct object of kalakue, flatter. So even the author is saying, yeah, even our souls as righteous men are flattered by these practices that have pleasures. And there are, and they do, those pleasures do helkuo toward themselves some. He doesn't say some, but he also doesn't say us, right? He's saying these hedonistic, or these practices having pleasures that on the one hand flatter our souls and draw toward themselves, but he doesn't say draw us toward themselves. He doesn't say draw our souls to themselves. He just says that these practices that have hedonistic pleasures flatter our souls and draw toward themselves, but he doesn't say whom they draw. Well, some indeed are drawn. But then he offers the on the other hand. They don't persuade, and then he goes on to say whom they don't. So there's nothing... So no, this is not a counterexample, at least not a definitive one. There is no direct object of helkuo here. He could just be saying, look, all humankind is flattered by these practices, and some are indeed drawn to it, or drawn to them, but not those of us that have righteous, moral mindsets or whatever, he goes on to say. So this is not a counterexample. Here... So I went looking after I concluded what I just showed you for what might be a more likely candidate for a counterexample. This is same writing, except instead of, it's Plato's Republic, but instead of 538d, it's 550a. And I'm not going to read the Greek for you here because it's much longer. But the translation that's provided by that same Perseus Digital Library includes the youth hearing such things. So he's talking about youth, and he says on the one hand they hear such things, and on the other hand they listen to the words of their father. They are drawn or solicited by both. And he goes on to say, under these two drawings or solicitations, he turns over the government in his soul to ambition and high spirit, and becomes a man haughty of soul and covetous of honor. And so what one might think this is saying is that you've got two competing drawings, but only one of them succeeds in winning the person over. But as it turns out, no, that's not what this text is saying. And the reason is because I've left a little bit of text out. What I've left out is here in the red. And when you add that into the translation, what it's actually saying is that, yes, the youth, he hears and sees such things that he's just gotten done talking about. On the other hand, he listens to the words of his father, and he is in fact drawn by both. He comes to a compromise is the translation. The word is literally, he comes to the middle. And he turns over the government in his soul to the intermediate principle of ambition and high spirit. The intermediate between two things. And in fact, again, literally to the middle. So what this text is actually saying is that the youth are in fact drawn. They do in fact have a change of position affected, the ones he has in mind, from either of two opposite extremes to the middle. So drawing here affects a change as well. So as of yet, I'm still unable to find a clear example of an ineffectual drawing, even in classical Greek. But here's the thing, even if one can find a clear example of ineffectual drawing in classical Greek isn't Koine Greek. And meanings change over time. Let me give you an example. In modern English, the English we speak today, the word silly means some certain things, including the meaning captured in the 1869 Universal English Dictionary, which is foolish or witless, ridiculous, something along those lines. And that's an example of what silly means in what is known by linguists as modern English. But if you go back 400 years earlier, what you find is that silly meant innocent or harmless. It changed in the intervening 400 years. And in fact, when silly meant innocent or harmless was in the period of English's life known as Middle English. And a few hundred years still earlier than that, silly meant blessed in what linguists call Old English. So you can see that a developing language that has hundreds of years to develop, a word like silly, and for that matter, a word like draw, will change meanings. Or at least can and often does. And in fact, the difference between classical and Koine Greek is analogous to the difference between Old and Middle English, or even between Middle and Modern English. So in the very lengths of time during which the English word silly has changed meanings, so too, if one could find an example of helkyo, meaning an ineffectual drawing in classical Greek, that would be like finding the word silly to mean innocent or harmless in 400 years ago literature, but that wouldn't mean that 400 years later, in today's time, it means that as well. That wouldn't follow. So even if somebody finds the word helkyo in classical Greek referring to something that may or may not affect a change, doesn't mean that that's what it can mean in Koine Greek. The Koine Greek in which the New Testament is written, the Koine Greek into which the Septuagint is translated, the Koine Greek in which Josephus wrote, etc. All right, so at least as of this point, I know of no counterexamples to my conclusions, and even if there were in classical Greek, it wouldn't matter. What one needs to find is a counterexample in Koine Greek. So now let's turn to the impact that should be had on our interpretation of John 6:44 by verses 45 and 65. So first, let's listen to a clip in which Dan talks about how verse 45 appears to him to be providing the means by which God does the drawing.
It doesn't even really give a description of how God draws, but there's a suggestion as to how God draws, and that's verse 45 explains verse 44, at least the way I see it. So the Father is teaching people about Christ, and teaching and learning requires both a student and an instructor. So it's yeah, I'm a homeschooling parent, so I know this kind of from firsthand experience. Like I can be up there teaching, and it won't make a difference unless the students are applying themselves also.
And in fact, a little bit later in a clip I won't play, he says this sounds to him like a synergistic process, meaning God is working to teach, but the person being taught must work to learn. And if they don't work to learn, or if they don't succeed in learning, then they don't learn, that kind of thing. So what Dan is arguing is that verse 45 is giving us the means by which God draws, and the means by which God draws are means that may or may not affect a change. That's the argument here. Well, let's evaluate that. Firstly, it's simply not the case that learning necessarily entails effort, that it is necessarily a synergistic process. All right. So, for example, in Acts 22:27, Luke tells us that the tribune came and said to Paul, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" And Paul said, "Yes." And then a little bit later in Acts 23:27, we see that tribune writing to Felix, if I remember correctly. He's writing to somebody, a Roman official. He says that he's writing to them and says, "I came upon them with soldiers and rescued Paul, having learned," same word, "that he was a Roman citizen." Now notice all that took place for the tribune to learn that Paul was a Roman citizen was for Paul to say it. There was no effort, there was no chance that Paul would say yes and the tribune would fail to learn. So here's an example where learning is purely passive. There is no effort involved. The learning just comes with the revelation. Similarly, in Exodus 2:4, in the Septuagint, Moses' sister was watching from a distance to learn what would happen to him. See, when Moses' sister sees Moses rescued from the river by Pharaoh's daughter, she immediately learns what happens to him. The seeing, the observation, is contemporaneous with the learning. They just happen together, and it's entirely passive. Or take Proverbs 6:8 in the Septuagint. The proverb, the ostensibly Solomon, the writer of Proverbs, but I say ostensibly because that's an open question. He says, "Go to the bee and learn how diligent she is, how earnestly she is engaged in her work." Learning here doesn't mean attempt to understand what's going on here while you're watching it. No, observing the bee is enough to bring about the learning. It's entirely passive. So all of this is just to say that and there are other examples you could come up with as well. The point is that being taught by God, that is, hearing and learning from the Father, can't be assumed to be synergistic in that sense that Dan is implying of being contingent upon the learner's effort. Learning can be completely passive reception of knowledge. Okay? So there is no argument to be made, as far as I can tell, that the hearing and learning here is the means by which God is drawing and requires effort on the part of those being taught, effort they may or may not exercise. There's just no basis for that. Could that be what's going on? Maybe, but there's certainly no basis for arguing that. It's just an assumption being made about those phrases. Now, but I want to go further than that and argue. I'm not infallible, so I could be wrong about this argument, but I'm going to argue that actually what Jesus says in John 6:45, when he says what he says in John 6:45, he's not identifying the means by which God is drawing. That's the means of God's drawing isn't even the point. See, in John 5:46, the previous chapter to this, Jesus says to his hearers, "If you believed Moses, you would believe me." And then after John 6:44, he says, "Has not Moses given you the law? Yet none of you keeps the law." You see, John 6:44 is sandwiched between Jesus saying that his hearers aren't really obeying or listening to or believing Moses. And then, right in the middle, but sandwiched between those two slices of bread, as it were, right, very close to John 6:44, Jesus says this, or the Jews ask Jesus this: "What sign do you do that we may see and believe you? Our fathers ate the manna in the wilderness." So notice what they're saying. They're saying, our fathers followed Moses because he gave them a sign. If you want us to follow you, you better give us a sign too. And what does Jesus say in response to them? It was not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven, but my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven, which is myself. All right, so we're still right here in that context of John 6:44. What Jesus is doing is challenging their claim to be followers of Moses. And then in John 6:35, Jesus says to them, "I am the bread of life." And in verse 41, the Jews grumble about him because he said, "I am the bread of life that came down from heaven." And Jesus answers them, "Do not grumble among yourselves." And then he goes on to say, "I am the bread of life. Your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness, and they died. I am the bread of life that comes down from heaven, so that one may eat of it and not die." You see, sandwiched between the two accusations of the Jews not really following Moses like they thought, Jesus says he's the bread of life that is the typological fulfillment of the manna from heaven that was the sign that the Israelites saw and prompted them to follow Moses. So, but there's more here. Watch this. In Deuteronomy 1:1, in the Septuagint, the text says, "These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel." And then a couple of chapters later, Deuteronomy 4:10, Yahweh said to me, "Gather the people to me that I may let them hear my words, so that they may learn to fear me." Hear and learn. In fact, in the Septuagint Greek, it's the same two words, hearing and learning. And of course, Yahweh here is the Father. And then in Deuteronomy 5:1, Moses summons all Israel and says to them, "Hear, O Israel, the statutes and rules that I speak in your hearing today, and you shall learn them and be careful to do them." And then, by the way, manna is mentioned just a little bit later in 8:3. Are you seeing all the pieces fit together here? See, there isn't any evidence in the text that Jesus is in John 6:45 that he is explaining the means or identifying the means by which the Father draws. There's no, in Greek there are some words that could connect that, right? So after saying, "No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him," he could say, "Gar for." In the scriptures it says, "All will be taught of God. Everyone who hears and learns from the Father comes to me." He could say "gar" or some other logical connection, but he doesn't. There's no evidence that what Jesus is doing is identifying the means of drawing. Rather, when you put all these pieces together, what seems pretty clear is that Jesus' point is typological. Their disbelief proves they aren't true followers of Moses, and therefore, by extension, of Yahweh. That's his point. Now, that doesn't make verse 45 support for Calvinism either. It's not like we can argue from from John 6:45 to a Calvinist understanding of John 6:44. Not by this alone. We'll get to that in a second. But we also can't argue from John 6:45 that what Jesus is doing is identifying the means of drawing, number one, and that number two, those means are resistible. There's just no argument to be made there. It's not an impossible reading of the text, but certainly not a merited one either. But there may be more to say on John 6:45. And it has to do with the Isaianic, the text from Isaiah text that Jesus quotes. So let's hear Dan on that.
The text in Isaiah 54:13, though, I do think is saying that all of Israel is being taught by God. And that is somewhat suggestive of resistibility, because not all of Israel is learning from God.
So notice what Dan is saying. Dan is saying that Jesus is quoting an Old Testament text in which, according to Dan, God is teaching all Israel, but some of them aren't following him, which would seem to indicate that the drawing, likewise, is something that the Father is doing for everyone, but is not being effective for some, because they're resisting it. But that's not going to hold up here under scrutiny. So Isaiah 54:13 says, "All your children shall be taught by the Lord, and great shall be the peace of your children." Notice two things. First of all, these are both shall be's, not are being. They're both shall be's. But also notice that the words taught and peace. The reason this is relevant is because earlier, previous to Isaiah 54:13, in the context of what we would, by the time of chapter 53, identify as the suffering servant says, "The Lord God has given me the tongue of those who are taught. He awakens my ear to hear as those who are taught." And by the way, this Hebrew word is not a frequently used one. All right? But it is the same word here, for taught. And then as for peace, in Isaiah 53:5, the suffering servant is pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities, and upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. I just noticed a typo. I said brow instead of brought. Sorry. So notice, number one, Israel's children shall be taught by the Lord, and they shall have peace, not is being taught and not is having peace. And secondly, notice that the same teaching and peace language there in the text being quoted is connected with the suffering servant. See, Isaiah isn't saying all Israel is being taught by God. He's saying all Israel will be taught by God one day. And it's a prophecy that is inseparably linked to the prophecy of the coming Messiah, who would die in their place and thereby bring them peace. Now, the question becomes, well, when will Christ has come, right? He by the time John is writing his gospel in John 6, Christ has come. So if he is fulfilling this very text in their very presence, then what about the fact that all Israel isn't responding? What do we make of that? Well, we'll come back to that in a second. I accidentally jumped the gun a little bit. I just wanted to offer some scholarly support for what I'm saying, that these are eschatological prophecies, not describing the present state of Israel. So notice Gordon McConville. He says he talks about the images in this passage of Isaiah about new birth, new beginning, ancient promises to Abraham, the everlasting covenant, new Zion. See, this is all an eschatological vision that will be accomplished one day. Or take Andreas Kostenberger. In his commentary on the New Testament use of the Old Testament, he observes that the New Testament context is believers in Jesus being the end-time disciples of Yahweh. Jesus asserted people would witness at the present time the fulfillment of the prophetic vision that all would be taught by God. And he says that the context of this in Isaiah 54:13 is a grand vision of Jerusalem's restoration. So, yes, these scholars are just saying the same thing I'm saying, which is that the text in Isaiah 54 that Jesus is quoting is not describing Israel in Isaiah's present. It's describing a future restored Israel. But now we can ask that question I asked a moment ago, which is, well, what about the fact that in Jesus' day, when these prophecies are being fulfilled, not all Israel is coming to Jesus? Well, consider what Paul says in Romans 9. Not all who are descended from Israel belong to Israel, because it's the children of the promise who are counted as offspring. And at the present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace. Now, understand me, I'm not here arguing from I'm not here arguing from a Calvinistic reading of Romans 9 to 11. All I'm saying is that the reason, according to Paul, why not all of Israel in his day are responding, believing in Jesus, is because not all of them are truly Israel. within the people of Israel, within the biological descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is a subset of Jewish people who are truly Israel. They are the children of the promise, and they are the remnant of Israel chosen by grace. So the all in Isaiah's prophecy, they will all be taught by God, is not every individual of either global humanity or even the smaller population of Israel. Rather, the all that Isaiah prophetically says will be taught by God is the grace-given believing remnant that would follow Messiah. So now we come back to John 6:44 and 45. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. They will all be taught by God. Everyone who's heard and learned from the Father comes to me. See, Jesus' use of Isaiah is not meant to identify the means by which the Father draws people to Jesus. We've already seen there is no basis, no evidence for that conclusion. It is just an assumption. But when we put all these pieces together, when we look at what's going on, when we look at the relevant literature, etc., what we see is that, at least I'm arguing, that what I think we see is that Jesus' use of Isaiah is meant to support his claim that only those given to him by the grace of his Father will receive him. Whatever that means. All right? However you understand that, whether Calvinistically or not, the point is Jesus appears to be quoting Isaiah 54:13 and saying everyone who has heard and learned from the Father comes to me in order to substantiate his claim that his hearers aren't believing because they haven't been given to him by the Father. Okay. But now let's turn to verse 65. So verse 45 can't inform our understanding of verse 44 in such a way that would argue for a non-Calvinist reading. But what about verse 65? See, in last episode, I argued, I broke down the Greek and I showed that that in verse 65, Jesus does not say, no one can come to me unless the Father enables him, which is the text that Leighton Flowers quoted and argued, therefore means that verse 44 doesn't mean effect a change, but rather enable. And I concluded, no, that's not true. Well, let's hear how Dan picks up on that. So likewise, Jesus isn't talking about inviting or enabling him in verse 65 of John 6. He's not saying people are enabled to come to him in John 6:65. He's saying coming to Jesus is given to people by the Father. This does not at all support Dr. Flowers' reading of John 6:44. So, now I'm not saying the reading of John 6:44 is wrong, Dr.
Okay, so let's pause there and look at the passage itself, I suppose. And we'll probably have to go to the Greek, but I'll just pull it up in English and we can look at it in a couple different English versions. So the Dr. Flowers was looking at the NIV, which says, and he went on to say, this is why I told you that no one can come to me unless the Father has enabled them. And so for starters, I'll admit that the NIV isn't literal, right? I think it's probably not a great translation. It's probably, but I do think it's the right interpretation. Probably the point that I disagree with Chris the most on is that what is given to the person is to come. And I think it is the ability to come that is given to the person. And that's because in ability is the main verb, and then to come is in the infinitive or something like that. But let's look at it in the Greek, I guess.
So notice what Dan argues. He argues that because the text uses an indicative verb, meaning has the ability, of course, Jesus is negating it, does not have the ability. But because he uses an indicative verb that refers to ability, and then in an infinitive, to come, because the indicative verb have ability, because that's the indicative verb, therefore what Jesus is saying the Father grants to this person must therefore be the ability that person doesn't have. But this argument just does not hold any water, and it doesn't take much creativity to see why. Consider these two English sentences. No one can have the job of president unless the American people give it to him. Or how about no one can access the corporate intranet unless the network and firewall grant it to him? So these two English sentences both talk about people who don't have an ability to do something, and then something is given to them. But what's given isn't the ability. What's given is the having or the accessing. In the statement, no one can have the president unless the American people give it to him, what's being given to them is the job of president. And in the statement, no one can access the corporate intranet unless the network and firewall grant it to him, what they grant is the access. Not the ability to access, but the access itself. An attempt comes in to access the intranet and the network software, network hardware, and firewall, all that together, either grant that access or don't. They don't grant the ability, they grant the access. And it's not just English. We see this in Greek as well. So here's John 3:27, and this came up in their discussion, and they rightly identified that it's not truly a parallel, but notice what this text says. A person cannot receive even one thing unless it is given him from heaven. Now, the reason this isn't a parallel is because there is something to which the it might refer that isn't the inability. It's the one thing, right? So it's not a true parallel. But notice that after the word cannot, what's given isn't ability. So the fact that ability is mentioned here does not suffice as an argument that what is given is ability, and therefore given ability can be rightly interpreted as enabled. That argument doesn't hold up. But Dan does attempt, and I want to be very clear here. I'm not at all trying to oh boy, Susan says she's having connection problems. I hope nobody else is. Can anybody else confirm or deny whether they are experiencing connection problems as well? I'd hate for anything I'm saying to be missed by anybody. But anyway, now just to be clear, I'm not at all in what I'm about to do. I'm not at all trying to belittle Dan. Dan has made no claim to be trained in the biblical languages, as far as I can tell. Thank you, Dan, for confirming that. I appreciate it. But it sounds like some others are. Well, I hope I don't know what to do. I'm pretty sure my connection, I'm being told by YouTube, oh, it is on my end. Well, now I'm concerned. But my internet speed test is telling me that I'm okay. So I'm going to keep pressing forward and hopefully all turns out okay. But anyway, so as far as I know, Dan makes no claim to be proficient in biblical languages. And I've been in his exact shoes in what we're about to see, in trying as somebody who has no meaningful knowledge of biblical language grammar, trying to piece together what the grammatical implications of a text might be based on what he's going to show us from Blue Letter Bible. So I'm not trying to belittle him. I'm not, Dan, since you're in the stream, I'm not trying to belittle you, but I do want you but I do want to show you why what you attempt in the clip we're about to watch doesn't work. So let's watch that.
So it's no one, oidos. Then it's dynamo, which is ability or can, and then erkomai, and the erkomai is n, so that's infinitive. So to come. No one, I think probably the right translation would be is able to come unto me except it were given. So there's a gift from the Father unto him, to the person. So I think it's what God is giving is the ability to come, which is not literally enabled, but that's the right sense. That's the right interpretation. I did notice the third person singular, which matches from it. Okay, so it were. So this is third person singular, and then the can is third person singular. So except it were given. So the it seems to be most directly connected with the can, not the infinitive to come. But I'll also be very hesitant to draw anything hard and fast off of that, because every time I do, I find out that I don't know enough.
This is one of the reasons I really appreciate Dan. He knows his limits. He's not he's not trying to pretend as though he is able, given his lack of training in biblical languages, assuming I'm right about that. He doesn't pretend as though he can really make a compelling argument from the grammar because he's not trained in it. I wish more non-Calvinists would do likewise. So I have nothing but respect for Dan here, but he is right that he's going to find out he was wrong. So let's break this down. Notice that what Dan's very hesitantly and tentatively offered argument is, what his argument is that because the verb can and the verb give, because those two verbs are both third person singular. For those of you who, we're going to get a little into the weeds here, as if we haven't already gotten into the weeds, right? We're going to get a little more into the weeds. If you aren't interested in the weeds of Greek grammar, then go get a drink or something and come back in 60 seconds. Or maybe 120 seconds. Third person is he, she, or it, or they, right? So first person is I or we, second person is you or y'all, and third person is he, she, it, or they, all right? And singular is singular as opposed to plural, or in the biblical languages, both Hebrew and Greek, if my memory is serving me correctly, there's also dual. At the very least, there's dual in Hebrew. Maybe I misspoke about Greek. But either way, it's singular as in he, she, or it, as opposed to plural, they. All right? So Dan's argument is that because both the verb is able and the verb is given are both third person singular, so he, she, or it, rather than they, or you, or y'all, or whatever. Therefore, and because the infinitive to come is neither third person singular, or neither third person nor singular, therefore the can and the given are more closely connected than the to come and given. But this is a case of just simply not understanding how Greek grammar works.
Can.
So here's the text. Oudes dunatai elthein pros me eon me e dedamenon auto ek tu patras. All right, no one can come to me unless it is granted him by the Father. Now, oudes I've colored blue because it's a subject of a verb. Dunatai, I've colored black because it's the verb is able or can. All right? No one can. Oudes dunatai. The reason why dunatai, meaning is able, is in the third person and singular is because the subject is. Oudes, no one, is third person singular. And in Greek and in many other languages, what are called inflected languages, highly inflected languages, Spanish, I think, is an example. There are others. In such highly inflected languages, unlike English, the verb and the subject of the verb have to agree in number and in person, and typically in gender as well. So, oudes is third-person singular masculine. Dunatai is third-person singular. The reason the verb is third-person singular has nothing at all to do with what's coming after it. It's third-person singular because the subject of the verb is third-person singular. Susan says, this is slowing Chris down to our speed or level. Yeah, this is true. All right, but let's continue. The verb dedamenon, I want to say that's a participle. But anyway, that verb has within it an implied subject, it. I say it's implied. The highly inflected languages, the verbal form very often will tell you things like the person and number of the subject, right? So in English, we have to say it is granted to indicate that a third-person singular object is granted. But in Greek, all you have to say is dedamenon. because it implies that the form of the verb here tells you that it's third person singular. Now, and so all of this is just to say that I've highlighted the Greek in black, but in the English I've highlighted the implied subject blue. Now, the point of that is that the subject implied by the verb it, that must tie back to what's known as an antecedent. Something previously mentioned that is this third-person singular subject of granted. That's what an antecedent means, something that came previously to which it refers back. But here's the thing. The very nature of being the subject of a verb means that the thing that is the subject of the verb must be what's called a nominal, or another word for that is substantive. So if you remember anything from, I said 120 seconds, more like 10 minutes. Go back and use the bathroom, maybe have a chat with a coworker or a friend or something, and then come back. A nominal or a substantive, what's going on here is that if you remember sort of your elementary English grammar, you've got subject, verb, and object, and the things that can be the subjects or objects of a verb are either nouns or phrases in place of nouns. So, for example, I could say, running is fun, right? Or running wears me out, right? Well, running is a verb, but it's what's called a gerund or gerund, and it's a form of the verb that is functioning like a noun, right? So it's nominal, it's a substantive. But what you couldn't have as the subject of a verb is just another verb. You need a nominal, so a verbal noun, if you will, if it's a verb at all. Now, what that means is that dunatai can't be the subject of it is given, because dunatai is not a verbal noun. It's not a nominal. It's not a substantive. It's just an outright indicative verb. And that can't be, as far as I know, the subject of another verb. So that leaves a few candidates. But two of those candidates don't work. Oudes, meaning no one, and me, meaning me, can't be the antecedent of it in it is granted. And the reason is because the it in it is granted is neuter. Okay? Koine Greek, like some other languages, has gendered words. And in the case of Greek, a word could be masculine, it could be feminine, or it could be neuter. And in the same way that a verb and its subject must agree in person and number, it also must agree in gender. Well, oudes is masculine, so that can't be the neuter it in it is given. And in to me, that me, meaning me, is also masculine, and so it can't be the antecedent of it in it is granted. That leaves only one candidate, and that's elthane. Elthane is an infinitive verb, not an indicative, and infinitives are frequently nominals. Infinitives are frequently the subjects of verbs and the objects of verbs, the object of prepositional phrases, indirect objects. Infinitives are frequently nominals. And an infinitive is neuter as a nominal. So it is what is the antecedent. To come or coming is the antecedent of it in it is given. Coming is given. Now, just as proof that infinitives frequently are nominals, and as proof that infinitives are often given, look at Matthew 13:11. Humin deratai gnonai. To you it has been given to know. Gnonai is the subject. To know has been given to you. Knowing has been given to you. What's given is the knowing, not the ability. Matthew 20:23. Kathesai ek dexion mu uk estin emon dunai. To sit at my right hand is not mine to grant. So kathesai, to sit, sitting, is the subject of or the object in this case, of granting. So what's given is the sitting, not the ability to sit. Acts 2:27, ude doses idein diaphtharon. God did not abandon his Holy One to Hades or let him see corruption. Let is a bit of a dynamic translation. It's literally give, it's grant. So the Holy One, Jesus, while dead, was not given to see. Idein, the infinitive, see, is the object of the verb. It's nominal. And again, what is in this case not given, but still the referent of given, is the corrupting, not the ability to corrupt. 2 Timothy 1:18, doe auto ha kurias hurein eleos. May the Lord grant him to find mercy. Again, the infinitive hurein, to find, is the nominal that is the direct object of give. In other words, what's given is the finding mercy, not the ability to find it. And so likewise, in John 6:65, udes dunatai elthein prosme eon me e dedamenon auto ek tu patras. No one is able to come to me unless to come is granted him by the Father. Again, what's given is the coming, not the ability to come. So no, John 6:65 is not properly translated, not even properly interpreted, unless the Father enables him. That's not what's going on here. Neither would it be appropriate to say, no one is able to come to me unless the ability is given to him by the Father. No, it doesn't work. What is given to this person that is therefore able to come is coming. Coming is what is granted to this person. So, yeah, Dan, again, no, I'm not trying to belittle you, because you didn't claim, in fact, you very strongly disavowed any education in Greek grammar, so I'm not at all trying to belittle you or demean you or anything like that, but hopefully now you can see why the argument is it's very difficult, at the very least, it's difficult to argue that what Jesus is saying in John 6:65 is that the Father enables people to come. All right, so now let's talk about the context. The reason, what I mean by this is the reason why Jesus, or the context in which Jesus says, no one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. So we Calvinists are very fond, as Dan knows, as Turton Fan knows, as Leighton Flowers knows, as Braxton Hunter knows, as everybody knows. We Calvinists are very fond of arguing, we would say just simply observing, but arguing that that Jesus offers what he says as an explanation for the disbelief of the people he's talking to. Right? So in John 6:41, John records that the Jews grumbled about him. And then in verse 43 and 44, Jesus answered them. So he's addressing their grumbling. And he says to them, do not grumble among yourselves. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. Right? It seems, we Calvinists think it seems pretty clear that what Jesus is doing is saying, there's no point in grumbling, because you can't come to me because the Father hasn't drawn you, or at the very least, the reason you're grumbling is because you might not have been given to me by the Father. And this is consistent with what he has said already earlier in John 5. He speaks of the Father, and he says, his voice you Jews have never heard. And you do not have his word abiding in you, as shown by the fact, that's my interpretation of the Greek gar there. And I'm not even sure I remember if I think it's gar. Anyway, gar doesn't always mean because. It can also mean so that or such that. Or, it's flexible. But the context seems pretty clear that what Jesus is saying, he's not saying, because you don't believe me, therefore you've never heard his voice. That would be absurd, obviously. The point Jesus is making is the fact that you've never heard the Father's voice is evidenced by you not believing in the one he sent. So Jesus offering, in John 6:44, offering the fact that nobody can come to me unless the Father draws him, that as an explanation why the people he's talking to are grumbling, fits perfectly with the explanation he's already offered a chapter earlier. The Father not believing Jesus is the evidence that they have not heard from their Father. Nevertheless, Dan suggests that we shouldn't understand that to be the point of what Jesus is saying in John 6:44, that he's not explaining his interlocutor's disbelief. Let's listen to Dan's argument.
One thing, just going way back to something he said quite a while ago, is this explains their unbelief. And I thought that, but the text that I'm wrestling with, for starters, you might be right, and I held that position for quite a bit of time, but there was a place that said, let's see, where's the meat which perishes? That's like in verse 30. The place where he says, labor not for the meat which...
it is 27.
27. Do not work for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures to eternal life. Okay, so isn't the rhetorical force of this passage saying to his immediate audience, there are two ways in front of you, and you're going down the wrong one?
I'm not sure I have any objection to that so far.
But if he's saying, if the explanation of, you're not believing because you're not able to believe, how do we square that circle?
I'm not sure I understand what's the circle.
Mm-hmm. It just seems
you want it to have to be that both possibilities are true, or things they can bring about, and
if not, what's the point? If you're, let's say that they're just unable to believe, which would seem to be the conclusion. So, I mean, in essence, you're saying, not only are they not actually drawn, but God isn't even trying to draw them, is what I'm hearing from you. So if that's the case, and they can't believe without the Father's drawing, and the Father doesn't want to draw them, and he won't draw them, so what's the point of saying, don't work for the food which perishes, but the food which endures to eternal life? And you could probably say, well, there's some other purpose, like holding them accountable to that standard or something like that. But it just seems like rhetorically that point just seems to be left hanging. If he's explaining to them the reason why they're unable, they aren't believing is because they can't believe, because the Father is just not giving them the only thing that could make them come, and the Father is just holding that back because he just doesn't want to give it to them. Then then I am puzzled at what the rhetorical point of verse 27 is.
Now, Turretin Fan went on to offer his answer to the question, and I'm not going to play that here. I do think his answer is a good one, but it's an answer to the question Dan is asking, or the question that is his answer is to a question that concedes a point that Dan is assuming. What I mean by that is, Dan is assuming that the same people that Jesus goes on to say, don't grumble among yourselves, no one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, are the same people to whom he says here in verse 27, don't work for the food that perishes, but work for the food that endures to eternal life. And if one concedes that, then Turretin Fan answers the question, well, if that's the case, why does he even say verse 27 to them? And I think Turton Fan's answer is a good one. It's legit. I think I would agree with it if I were to concede that assumption Dan is making. But as you might be able to tell by the way I've just been saying what I've been saying for the past few seconds, I don't concede that. And it really only takes a careful walk through the text to see what I'm about to show. Now, maybe an even more careful look through the text would make me realize I'm wrong in what I'm about to say. But as far as I can tell, I think I'm right. Let's look at it again.
One thing, just going away.
So here's verse 27, John 6:27. And you can see that I have hidden from your view some things that come before and some things that come after. So in verse 47, Jesus says to someone, don't work for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures to eternal life. Well, obviously, we need to find out whom Jesus is saying that to, right? Well, we see in the previous verse, 26, that Jesus is answering them. Okay, well, who's the them? Who are they? Who are the them Jesus is answering when he says, do not work for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures to eternal life? Well, just a couple of verses earlier, we see it's the achlas, the crowd. The crowd went to Capernaum seeking Jesus, and Jesus answered them, do not work for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures to eternal life. Okay, so now by looking before verse 27, we can see the ones to whom Jesus says, do not work for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures to eternal life. And notice that it is the crowd. Well, now let's plug in the other direction. Let's look after verse 27 to see who he's talking to when he says, don't grumble among yourselves. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. Is it just this same crowd? No. In verse 41, Jesus' audience changes. It's no longer the larger crowd, but now it's specifically the Jews. That is the grumbling Jews, the Jews who are resisting, who are refusing to believe. They grumble about him, and then it's immediately after that Jesus says to them, don't grumble among yourselves. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. So Jesus' plea, his exhortation, in John 6:27 that Dan is saying doesn't make sense if later in verse 44 Jesus is explaining their disbelief. That Jesus' plea or his exhortation in John 6:27 is to a mixed crowd. Some in that mixed crowd may very well be among those given to the Son. So it makes sense to tell a mixed multitude, some of whom may indeed have been given to the Son, don't work for the food that perishes, but work for the food that endures unto eternal life. But then by the time we get to John 6:44, Jesus is speaking to a specific subset of that crowd. Namely, the obstinate, rebellious Jews who are claiming to be following in the footsteps of Moses, but truly aren't, as evidenced by the fact that they don't believe Jesus. And Jesus explains their failure to heed his plea or exhortation by saying they haven't been given to the Son. They haven't been drawn to the Son. So we don't need to answer Dan's question in the way that Turton Fan did, because Jesus isn't talking to the same exact group of people in verse 27 that he goes on to speak to in verse 44. In fact, look at what he goes on to say later in John 6. In John 6, beginning at verse 60, the text refers to Jesus' disciples. And then Jesus says to them, his disciples, the 12 and perhaps many others, but at the very least, the 12 that includes Judas Iscariot, he says to that 12, so it's a mixed multitude, there are some of you who do not believe, and this is why I told you that no one can come to me unless it is granted to him by the Father. See, we saw earlier in John that Jesus explains why a subset of the larger mixed multitude does not believe, and it's because they haven't been given by the Father to the Son. They haven't been drawn by the Father to the Son. In the exact same way, he says here at the end of John 6, he says to his disciples, a subset of whom don't believe, that the reason they don't believe is because it hasn't been granted to them by the Father. See, Jesus is explicitly stating that what he's done is explain the fact that only some of his hearers believingly receive him. And what is that explanation? The Father gives coming to Jesus only to some. So with all of that out of the way, we're going to spend just a few more minutes and then we'll close up. This wasn't as long as I thought. But part of the reason it's not as long as I thought is because, frankly, I haven't had... I think I had originally hoped to have this next portion more fully developed. But as it turns out, I just have not had the time to fully develop this last point. This last portion of my presentation, which means that either Dan and I will continue the asynchronous conversation, or, and this is something we've been talking about, maybe we can continue the discussion synchronously, either on my show or his or whatever, and maybe even include Turret and Fan and maybe a non-Calvinist to even things out. I don't know. We'll see. But what I want to do now is offer that sort of inchoate, preliminary, nascent, underdeveloped analysis of Dan's reading. And what I mean here is a reading that assumes, that grants, for the sake of argument, the conclusion I came to last episode, which is that to draw is indeed to effect a change. It's not to draw is not to attempt to effect a change, it is to effect a change. He grants that. Again, this is why I have such admiration for Dan Chapa, and I feel similarly about David Paulman, is that they actually try to offer meaningful interpretations of texts that are non-Calvinist interpretations, but that account for the kinds of arguments that we're offering. So I want to look at that briefly. Here is a first of a few clips that Dan, where Dan begins to make clear what reading he's offering.
And then one other argument that, just based on this passage, that Chris didn't bring up is, no one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up on the last day. Now, while Chris Date doesn't address this one, I think others have, especially James White is pretty famous for that one. And so I figured I would just touch on that. And so I think it's pretty obvious that, coming to Christ is believing in Christ. And I'm not saying that, believers won't be resurrected by Christ. That's pretty, clear and straightforward. I think we agree on that point. But just because a person was actually drawn, and that believers will actually be resurrected, doesn't mean that it was inevitable that this person be drawn and then become a believer, and then that he will be resurrected.
So what Dan, I may not have included, I probably didn't include the clip that makes this the clearest, but the reading Dan is offering grants my conclusions from last episode, that to draw does mean to effect a change. But what Dan is offering is that that the Father is attempting to draw everyone. And so what he's arguing is, if draw does in fact mean to effect a change, that doesn't mean that God wasn't trying to draw everyone. No, he could be trying to draw everyone. Some are in fact drawn, and it is those who are drawn who will be raised. And he's offering this as a way to counter a popular Calvinist argument from the second half of verse 44. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him, that is the one drawn, I will raise him up on the last day. Now, Leighton Flowers tries to get around the force of this Calvinistic argument by saying that actually the one who is raised up is the one who may or may not have the ability to come. And it's the one who does end up coming, not the one drawn. But that's not going to work. Dan's argument here actually does work precisely because it grants that drawing is effectual, that the one who is drawn will in fact be raised. It's just that the group of people that are in fact drawn is a subset of the larger number of people that the Father is trying to draw. And so what I want to argue here is that Dan is right.
One other argument that...
Dan is right. if one grants, as he does while he's offering this reading, in other words, he's granting it for the sake of argument. He's not saying I'm right, although I'm hoping that by now he might be saying, okay, I'm a little more persuaded of your argument concerning helkyo. We'll see when I have a chance to interact with Dan more. But he grants for the sake of argument what I've concluded about helkyo, and he says he grants that A, some people aren't drawn, and B, those who are drawn do come to Jesus. And because he grants those things for the sake of argument in this reading, then he can legitimately say that A, God tries to draw everyone and does draw some of them, and B, he raises everyone so drawn. That seems like a legitimate answer to this particular Calvinistic argument, the one drawn is the one raised. That's a very popular Calvinistic argument, and what Dan has done is offered a non-Calvinist reading that defeats that argument. And the precise reason it defeats that argument is because it grants that drawing is effectual, but that God doesn't succeed in effecting that change in everybody. So God tries to draw everybody. He does draw some of them, the ones he succeeds in drawing, and they are the ones that he will raise. So the Calvinist argument loses its force there. And I think that this is the kind of path that a non-Calvinist needs to go down in order to be able to answer that particular Calvinistic argument. But there's more. Here's another thing that Dan says there.
And then one other question that came up, I think, Chris only briefly touched on this, but anyways, what about verse 37? All that the Father gives to me will come to me, and whoever comes to me, I will never cast out. So, here there is this type of, I would say it's a guarantee or something that it's effectual. 100% of the people that the Father gives to Christ come to Christ. And it is convenient, it's before coming to Christ. So, but who does the Father give to Christ? And perhaps a Calvinist might think, oh, it's those who are unconditionally chosen, and that's what that means. But I look at it as no, it's those that the Father has taught about Christ, and they've learned from Him.
So first of all, there was something I was about to say that I've forgotten, so never mind. But notice that what Dan is doing here is offering the same kind of reading in response to, he's offering the same reading as a defeater for a very similar popular Calvinist argument, one that's very similar to the one that he just answered. Namely,
and then one other question
he can grant. So the Calvinist argument is, look, the text says all the Father gives to Jesus will come to him and will never be cast out. Well, Dan is right. If one grants that A, some aren't given, and B, those who are given do come to Jesus and will never be cast out, then because one grants those things, then one can say, A, God tries to give everyone and succeeds in giving some of them, and B, raises everyone given, never casts out everyone so given. And this, again, is a legitimate answer to this popular Calvinistic reading, this popular Calvinist argument. If everyone the Father gives to the Son will come to him and will never be cast out, that's a real strong Calvinist argument if God is only giving some of humankind to Jesus, and all of that subset of humankind do in fact come to Jesus. But what Dan is saying is, yeah, I'm granting for the sake of argument that the Father doesn't give some to Jesus. It's just that he's trying to give everyone, and he succeeds in giving some. Again, that reading is the kind of reading that I think a non-Calvinist has to go down in order to answer these popular Calvinistic arguments. And I think this might be the last clip that I've got prepared, and this is where I'm going to start to push back. So let's listen.
So he's using Josephus, which is, a good source. But in any case, it's that reference to 1527, where somebody purposed by this to entice Anthony. Antony. So, and Chris himself admitted that the person actually wasn't enticed. That was just the purpose, right? So the way I look at it is, there's usually, in this type of things, there's like a force that's exerted and then the effect that it has on the object, right? So the force is exerted. So, if you, let's say, pull on a stone, the stone will either move or it will not move, but the force is there, right? And so if the force exerted doesn't result in the outcome, then, of the stone moving, then I think that's resistibility right there in a nutshell. Now, because what it implies is that the force that God uses isn't necessarily irresistible.
Okay, so notice the reading that Dan is offering based on one of the very texts I included in my survey last episode, namely Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews, 1527. What Dan is suggesting is, look, Josephus uses the word helkyo to speak of Delius purposing, intending to draw Antony, but failing. And by intend, I mean like actively tries. Okay? So what Dan is saying is, well, in the same way that Delius tries to helkyo Antony but fails, so likewise, perhaps the Father is trying to draw everyone, trying to helkyo everyone, but fails for some. And fail is a bit of a loaded word, but I just mean it in the neutral sense of does not manage to effect the change, right? Whatever. Okay. And we've already seen how that reading, granting as it does the effectual meaning of helkyo, answers popular Calvinist arguments from a couple of those verses. But let's see what I had prepared here. In fact, I say here, Dan is right. If Josephus can say that Delius intended to draw Antony but failed to draw him, then likewise, Jesus can think the Father intends to draw everyone, tries to draw everyone, but succeeds with only some. And that, on the face of it, is a legitimate reading. I mean, it seems plausible in terms of the lexical, the semantic domain, or the semantic field, or the range of meanings of the word helkyo. But I think that this faces some challenges that I think deserve some further exploring. Firstly, there are texts which do in fact say God draws all. In fact, this is a popular text. This in fact, I covered this last episode. This text, John 12:32, is one line of evidence that people like Leighton Flowers offer for arguing that draw doesn't necessarily mean effectual. Because Jesus says in John 12:32, when I am lifted up from the earth, I will helkyo, I will draw all people to myself. But of course, Leighton Flowers isn't a universalist, Dan Chapa isn't a universalist, and I'm not a universalist. So draw must mean he's wooing, he's drawing everyone, and only some come. But I dealt with that by showing that in the lexicons, it's not, I'm not making this up or arguing from the text. I'm simply pointing to the lexicons, who point out that the word pas, meaning all, often means all kinds. Well, if one pursues a reading like the one Dan has here proposed, according to which helkyo does mean to effect the change, and God does not effect that change in everybody, he does not draw everybody, but he tries to draw everybody. If one pursues that reading, then one might face a challenge here from John 12:32. And the only way to get around it, it seems to me, would be to concede that all here means all kinds. Now, Dan might be comfortable doing that, but there will be a lot of non-Calvinists who are not comfortable doing that. And part of the reason is because that would mean they'd have to admit that it's possible Calvinist readings of popular all texts are right. Right? There are several texts in the New Testament where Jesus is said to have died for all, or is loves all, is trying to save all, or whatever, and not willing that any should perish. Right? That kind of thing. And we Calvinists often point out that the word pos means all kinds of, not necessarily every single one of. And non-Calvinists typically call BS on us. And I pointed out in last episode by looking at the lexicons that it's not BS. It's just simply the fact of the case. It's just simply the fact of the matter. Well, if one pursues a reading like the one Dan has offered, they're going to have to concede that with regards this text in John 12, which they may be comfortable doing. But just be aware that that's one of the things you'll have to concede. The second point where I think that that challenges the reading that Dan seems to be pursuing is the going back to the point of Jesus saying what he says, which is to explain the disbelief. John 6:65, this is why I told you that no one can come to me unless it is granted by the Father. And it's the same thing in John 6:44. Don't grumble among yourselves. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. So what Dan is saying is the Father is trying to draw everyone, but some resist. And at least on the face of it, this seems to be saying that the Father's success is contingent upon the responsiveness of the people he's trying to draw. But at least ostensibly, Jesus is saying their responsiveness is contingent upon the Father's drawing them, which is the reverse of Dan's proposal. Now, I can already anticipate how Dan might try to answer this challenge, but I'll leave that to him, and we'll explore it together, perhaps either synchronously or asynchronously. Time will tell. But that's a second challenge that just at first glance, as I first give some thought to Dan's proposed reading, this is the second challenge that it seems to face. The third one is just the various ways that Jesus describes the Father's work here that all seem to be referring to the same thing and all seem to be efficacious and guaranteed to bring about the desired result for only those to whom he does it. So this is putting all the pieces that we've just gone through together. The Father gives only some to Jesus. That's just in the text. It's just got to be accepted, whatever that means. The Father draws only those he gives, only the some, right? He's not drawing everybody, he's drawing some. He teaches only those that he gives and draws. He's not teaching everyone. He gives coming to Jesus, that infinitive we looked at earlier. He gives that only to those that he gives, draws, and teaches. Right? And the people, the subset of humanity that he gives to Jesus, the subset of humanity that he draws to Jesus, the subset of humanity he teaches, the subset of humanity that he gives coming to Jesus, that subset of humanity exclusively and completely believe. Every one of them believe, and only those believe. So, according to Dan, the Father doesn't give everyone... let me back up. Not just according to Dan's proposed reading, but I'm arguing, according to the text itself, the Father doesn't give everyone. He doesn't draw everyone. He doesn't teach everyone. He doesn't give coming to Jesus to everyone. And all of those that he does give, does draw, does teach, and does give coming to Jesus, every one of them does believe. Nothing in the text whatsoever suggests that the Father is trying to give to everyone, trying to give everyone to Jesus, trying to draw everyone to Jesus, trying to teach everyone about Jesus, trying to give coming to Jesus to everyone. Nothing in the text suggests that he's trying to do that with everyone. So we've got at least 4 different ways in which Jesus says that the Father's work is upon some and guarantees their coming to Jesus, while everyone else that he doesn't do that to does not come to Jesus. We've got all of that, and we've got literally nothing in the text that suggests he's trying to do that with everyone. Nothing at all. Now, if we believe that all of Scripture, if we believe in tota scriptura, that all of Scripture is inspired, then if Dan is convicted that other texts in Scripture require that Jesus is that the Father is trying to do all 4 of these things with everyone, but succeeds only for some of them, then so be it. But at least in terms of exegeting this text, it certainly does lend itself far better to Calvinism than to any form of non-Calvinism. Or at the very least, I suppose Tim Stratton might try to argue that as a Molinist, he can say that the possible world that God actualizes, is one in which the Father is only giving some, drawing some, teaching some, whatever. But a not specifically Molinist reading, I think, is going to run into this challenge. Namely, there's all these different ways in which Jesus is saying the Father's activity is only to some and affects their salvation. And there's nothing in the text that says that he's trying to do all four of those things with all humankind. So that's where I have... Sorry about that. So that's what I've prepared. There's still a lot of exploring to do of Dan's proposed reading to see if it can truly be, if this text can truly be understood in a non-Calvinistic way. I'm not convinced that it can yet, but I also am not yet prepared to say it's impossible. So I'll be looking forward to continuing to explore this with Dan, either synchronously or asynchronously. But here's what I will stand by. There is no room in the semantic domain of helkyo in New Testament Koine Greek for a meaning like invite or enable or woo or something like that can be applied to a large group of people and resisted by some of them. No support for that, whatever. Leighton, I love you, brother. I'm so proud to be your colleague at Trinity, but you've got to stop that because you have no basis whatsoever for making that claim. And to all non-Calvinists who make this argument that God is drawing everybody, but only some respond to the drawing, no, you can't do that. Not if you want to take the text seriously. So that I'll stand by. And I'll also stand by the various points that I've made today, that, yes, Jesus is explaining the disbelief. Yes, he, or no, he is not offering the means of drawing when he quotes Isaiah and says, everyone who has heard and learned from the Father comes to him. No, he's substantiating his point that only those who come to the Father, or only those drawn by the Father, will come to him. And the other points that I've made. So I stand by what I've said in all of those terms, and what I'll leave you guys with is, this is to Dan, this is to Leighton, this is to any other non-Calvinist. If you want to deal honestly and seriously with the text of John 6, you're going to have to offer a non-Calvinist reading that accounts for the facts at hand, which is that draw does mean effect a change. And you're going to have to deal with the fact that in at least 4 different ways, Jesus says that the Father acts upon some in a way that guarantees their salvation, apart from which nobody else is saved. And those 4 ways are giving people to the Son, drawing people to the Son, teaching people about the Son, and coming to Jesus to people. My concern is that the reading you'll come up with is just one that, like the one Dan has offered so far, runs into the challenges that I described, including the challenge that you've got all these 4 different ways Jesus is saying the Father affects a change in people that apart from which no one can be saved, and as a result of which everyone that he so acts upon will be saved. A reading that accounts for those facts, but one like Dan's that says, well, he's trying to do all those things with everybody, is something that has to be read into that text. Doesn't mean that reading into it is illegitimate. That reading into it could be necessary in order to synthesize or harmonize what that text says with other texts. But I'm just trying to say, I'm not yet. I think there's still some challenges with this reading, but I'm looking forward to Dan exploring it further. And he has complimented me in the text, and I'm enjoying the discussion as well, Dan. And I look forward to seeing how we proceed. One last thing I'll say here: Peter W says, "I'm still trying to figure out what the Avengers have to do with Molinism." That's silly, Peter. Everyone who even tries knows exactly the relevance of the Avengers to Molinism. And the reason I say everyone who tries is because the only person who's tried to make that connection is Tim Stratton, and Tim Stratton has been extremely clear with how the Avengers has something to do with Molinism. Namely, in the Avengers Endgame, Doctor Strange sees a whole bunch of possible worlds, a whole bunch of possible futures, and actualizes one of them. I mean, it's obvious how the Avengers applies to Molinism. Now, does that mean Molinism is correct? No, of course not. But anyway. All right, I hope you've enjoyed this. I've got 5 minutes to go get ready for that interview I'm going to be doing. Again, let me put that back up on the screen so that you can go. Actually, you know what? I won't. Susan, if you're still in the chat, maybe you could put the link back. The link to the other show. I'm gonna be on there in 5 minutes. So I'm gonna wish you adieu, and I'll see you in 2 weeks on Monday, May 16th, 6 p.m. Pacific. Until then, bye-bye. I've been your host, Chris Date, and thanks so much for watching Theopologetics, where we think together through what we believe, why we believe it, and not something else. If you've enjoyed this episode, please click the thumbs up, like icon, the subscribe button, and the bell icon to receive notifications when new videos are streamed or uploaded. Either way, come back in 2 weeks for the next episode of Theopologetics, streaming live on YouTube every other Monday at 6 p.m. Pacific. Until then...